brief test, and this is to see how your memory works during a period of learning. I'm going to read a list of words, and I want you to try to remember them in order.
Welcome to the VO2 Lounge. This is episode 60 on doping in the Olympics, past and present. So in my last episode, I spoke about the biological passport in the Olympics and ended with some bits of information on how people could potentially still be using PEDs, performance-enhancing drugs, even with testing and the biological passport around based on the opinions of various critics. I mean, you don't have to go very far to find these critics, but it was based on those kind of opinions and my own thoughts to some extent. The next day, I was sat downstairs having a cup of coffee, going through YouTube on the TV. You know, it's my little treat to myself sometimes. I will watch on the big screen. And there was this interview by Insider with Victor Conte, a sports coach who designed doping programs with world-class athletes. Now, through his platform, the Bay Area Laboratory Bay Area Laboratory Cooperative, also known as BALCO, he supplied an untraceable designer steroid among other drugs to competitors who dominated the Sydney Olympics in 2000 and the Athens Olympics in 2004. Now, Conte used a transparent anabolic steroid nicknamed the Clear in training programs with track athletes such as Marion Jones, Tim Montgomery. He also develops doping programs for athletes in Major League Baseball, the National Football League, and other sports federations, so showing that it's not just isolated to things such as the Olympics. All sports can be clearly compromised. Now, let's get into the episode, but before I do, it's worth noting that where I personally stand on one, anti-doping, but also doping in general, I wouldn't say I am flat out for or against sort of thing, or as complex as it may seem. I wouldn't ever outright shame someone for using PEDs. Like, someone gets caught on drugs. Do I think they're a bad person? By no means. My main personal concern with PEDs is more there's a bit of transparency involved, because obviously it's not clear to the general public as to what's going on, and then at the amateur level where people are then deciding to take it upon themselves, and it muddies the amateur scene a bit, or a lot in some cases, but more the risk to the athlete is my personal concern. Obviously, at the elite level, if it's very well orchestrated and managed, the risks can be somewhat low, as in using moderate levels of testosterone with other agents to ensure things like testicular function remain high or adequate, and there's no testicular atrophy, for example, and just generally managing things well, not using ridiculous amounts, and monitoring any adverse effects from a medical professional of some description, versus when that then becomes the issue is where it trickles down to people who haven't got the funding to buy highly well regulated, or at least from a pharmacy who is trusted to get these drugs, and then also they're administering them and how they're administering them and how they're managing things. Just take, for example, Icarus, for example, the way that drug management program is handled. In that instance there, you can see it's very well managed, but when it trickles down to the sub-elites, or in his case, just someone who isn't aware, is doing this off their own back, and that's more, to me, where it becomes a problem. And obviously a problem if elites are causing harm to themselves because of it. So the easier way of putting it is, do I think the enhanced games, for example, is a good idea? No. Do I think clean sport is achievable in this current climate? No. I think major players would have to fund anti-doping incredibly heavily, and how invasive it would become, I don't know. But yeah, simply the level of rigor that would be needed, and the level of monitoring on the designer drug market, and the level of monitoring needed to catch microdosing, as we'll go into later, I think is too high for the level of funding that really anti-doping has currently. But let's get into the episode, and more specifically, what we're going to be getting into is just going through the video, essentially picking out the little gems and giving my 2 cents on this, really. So Conti opens up essentially explaining how this all begins, and probably how it begins for many people orchestrating systematic doping programs. He is essentially a coach who runs a program that involves extensive blood work to help advise athletes on supplementation. This supplementation leads to the inclusion of PEDs after being approached by a chemist who's made a designer steroid called THG. THG is tetrahydrogesterone, known by the nickname as the Clear, and it is a synthetic and orally active anabolic androgenic steroid, which has never was never marketed for medical use, as Conti describes. In general, right? It was developed by Patrick Arnold and was used by a number of high-profile athletes like Barry Bonds and Dwayne Chambers. Now, THG was developed completely in secret as a designer drug, essentially, on the basis that doping testers would unlikely detect a totally new compound. This is kind of one of the biggest arguments that there is at the moment for doping in multiple sports, is that, yes, no one's testing positive, say, for example, let's say the Tour de France or a marathon, although Kenyans at the moment are getting caught up in a bit of a doping like scandal, or whatever you want to call it. Is this designer drug when you've got teams, I'm going to keep it to cycling because it's a sport I know, but like UAE, where they have a huge budget, picking up or funding or purchasing from someone a designer drug isn't necessarily out of the question. And if it's been done before, it can be done again. And the idea here is just you are using something that's not being monitored. And he goes on to say that he utilizes it himself in what sounds like a one-off. Essentially, he takes the drug himself, pees in a cup, performs the drugs test himself, and comes up clean. So he goes, wow, any of these drugs that are not getting, like you're not getting popped for, essentially, he is then going to attempt to feed these drugs into the program. Now, just to go back a step, anabolic androgenic steroid, androgens are just a group of hormones essentially produced by the body naturally or endogenously. Anabolic steroids, where is mostly what people have heard them as, but it is essentially just improving muscle, the amount of mass you can maintain / repair. And obviously, to a lot of people, they may associate steroids or anabolic androgenic steroids or just anything like testosterone or growth hormone with bodybuilders, because obviously they are now trying to have a super physiological amount of muscle on the body. But when it comes to an athlete who's still damaging their body, shall we just say, to keep it simple, they're going out on like a 2-hour run, a 5-hour bike ride, and they need to recover, and the ceiling at which they reach can to some extent be determined by the quality of work they are able to achieve at a given volume. Now, if you need to improve the quality, the intensity, or the duration of the work you are doing, and you are at your, let's say you're at your physiological limit, just like you can be at a physiological limit for muscle mass, by adding these steroids, you essentially are improving that ability. And then when it comes to in-competition doping in this regard, the reason you would be doing it is for exactly that. Say you're an 800 meter or 1,000 or 1,500 meter runner, and the physiological toll of running that 1,500 meter qualifier is extremely high for you, because maybe you need to go to very close to your limit to qualify. Then introducing steroids allows for the swift or improved recovery for the following rounds. So in between rounds, regardless of the intensity, it is going to have a benefit. So it's not only something you train with, but it's also something you could definitely have in competition. Now, sometimes in passing conversation, someone new or outside of cycling or athletics in general, because they're the things that get associated with doping, people never think of football for doping, and this is football as in UK-esque football, not American football. But they might ask me, just because they know I'm interested in the sport and there's some kind of doping thing going on, and they're just like, oh, I'll ask someone who likes the sport what drugs these people are on. And given the previous comments, the answer is stuff we have never heard of for the most likely, but also it's probably a bit of a cocktail, to be honest. I mean, I'm somewhat of a cynic in the sense that I just don't believe many, if any, sports are particularly clean. Because if you can't get caught on the substances, and the fact that there are people getting caught in sports means that there's no way it's isolated to a couple people. It more, to me, points towards when the controls aren't tight enough. The methodology maybe isn't there, although arguably I suppose it is. It's more likely just a financial capability. It's just hindered by finances and the wit and ingenuity of various different people to orchestrate large and small scale activities and go undetected, essentially. Now, Conti discusses how people always refer to the clear as being the drug they were smashing, but he suggests it was too potent a steroid, essentially, to take in large doses continuously. And he explains how they would alternate between this and a testosterone cream that would help keep their ratio between epitestosterone and testosterone in line with that of a clean athlete. With it means you essentially, it is a masking agent. And on top of this, he suggests they were using growth hormone and EPO essentially to increase work capacity for of the athletes, which is what I've kind of stated before, that essentially a sprinter, a marathon runner, obviously a marathon runner directly benefits from EPO in competition. How much a sprinter benefits from EPO in competition, I can't really say, because the energy system, I honestly don't think it would be that great a benefit. What it is benefiting them is their just ability to do work, do more strength and conditioning, let's call it, and general drills without fatigue and remain high in quality, because essentially it would improve recovery time during a session. And so they can get more maybe bouts of high intensity work, and that goes for in the gym and on the track. And simply that's it. These cocktails, as you can call them, from Conti, you can see that they're not necessarily single silver bullet substances. And you can see that with individuals who've in the past, the past, not in the last 5 years, for example, have died in things like the Tour, and what's come back is a cocktail of substances that are in the bloodstream, all to aid performance, essentially. That's it. And he highlights this fact that it's not one single drug used. And the key thing to take away from it is the masking agent, that where there is one drug being used to improve performance, there will likely be another to either maintain normal function of other things, like, for example, the testicles when you're using synthetic or exogenous testosterone to top yourself up. The athlete probably still wants to have children at some point, doesn't want to suffer from testicular atrophy, and so goes ahead and uses other substances to maintain these functions. Now, that's not a masking agent, but it, to some extent, arguably could be, because technically you could test an individual under the biological passport, say, for example, when the person comes off testosterone, even if they're using testosterone to maintain kind of like a upper natural level perpetually, which you're not capturing because you're only taking snippets, you're only taking a blood test. So although it's high, you don't understand how perpetually high it is. Like, rather than say their T-score's 1,000, okay, yeah, it could be legitimate, but what would highlight its illegitimacy is that a normal person at 1,000, maybe day 1 they're 1,000, day 2 they're 1,000, day 3 they're like 950, day 4 they're like 900 or something, then they're at like 965, and a person could then just top up to flatline at 1,000, say, for example. But what could come up is if they're, topping up from 500 to 1,000, is that then when they come off the testosterone, that then they have a real big tank through the 500 mark, because maybe they're like, essentially the natural function has decreased below its previous state, and therefore you could pick them up on that. So essentially you need to use additional substances during the cycle to ensure that it's functioning. Now, all he's doing really is, obviously that's a little snippet from me, but highlighting the complexity of these programs and how it's not just someone rocking up at a pharmacy going, yeah, I'll have this, this, and this, injecting it and going, bruh, there you go. There is cycling, there is masking agents, and there is ensuring that you are doing an adequate amount for your sport, but not going past that point, essentially. So what about testing? Now, this section I think is particularly useful / insightful for people who don't understand how athletes have got away with doping in the past, because you may look at it as, there's testing, so if you take anything, you'll get caught by the test. It's like if you don't study for an exam, you don't just turn up, do the exam, and score well. You get found out and score badly. Now, he highlight how testing would only be performed. Now, this is historically. Historically, testing would only be performed in competition up until 1990 at the Olympics, right? So it was only in competition testing. Before this point, you could carry out your meticulous doping protocol during training, then taper off for the Olympics, which essentially highlights the lack of understanding present at that time as to how these drugs work. They're not necessarily drugs that the gains don't disappear essentially fully. It's like, just think of muscle mass. You don't go to the gym for 4 weeks. You don't suddenly shrivel up. And it's just like a taper in an endurance sport. You reduce your intensity, and yes, you could argue you lose some absolute fitness, but the absolute fatigue is also reducing, so the relative fitness is increased, is essentially how you can look at it. The relative fitness is now improved, so there you go. Now, maybe on drugs, the relative fitness is not higher but than if you were still on the drugs. However, the relative fitness / the fitness overall compared to where you were 8 months ago pre-cycle is going to be higher. Now, to add insult to injury, even at the 2000 Olympic Games, EPO and growth hormone were not tested for in competition, specifically for people who weren't long distance runners, and therefore could be used to aid in recovery during the Olympics. As I mentioned before, growth hormone, EPO, you could use them to essentially fast track your recovery post qualifiers, quarterfinal, semi-final, whatever it is. Now, obviously, now we have in and out of competition testing. You've got WADA managing things. However, I don't have as cynical a view. I never necessarily like to fully point the finger and suggest something's happening that I have no understanding of when it comes to specifically corruption. When it comes to utilizing of drugs, it's like, okay, there's some evidence here that people are doing crazy shit. Well, what could be the case? Could it be doping? Could it be changes in training? Yeah, it could probably be both. How would they get away with doping? Well, X, Y, and Z. Designer substances, microdosing, simply managing things in a way that means it's not detectable. All these things. Now, Conte points to potential corruption with some, I don't know whether you can call them anecdotal, because he's suggesting someone, he has witnessed it. But yeah, this is probably the most provocative part of this video in particular. And the opinion statement is that WADA being founded was not to protect the athletes and their health, but to protect the brand images surrounding the Olympics. Now, let's play this out. Now, I don't know where the stigma around doping came from. Now, whether it's the use of drugs in general having the stigma, or if it is the nature of cheating that has the stigma, or if it's just a combination of the two, or if it's something that's just drilled into society through these things and it's banned, so it must be bad. But the effect on brands to have being paying someone or supporting an organization who either the individual's doping or the athletes within it, so the IOC, are doping, looks bad for them, and they wouldn't want it necessarily, right? So you would want to introduce some kind of anti-doping protocol or system to promote to the world that we are not for doping, essentially. We have managed this poorly in the past. Now we're managing it. But you can see then again how, for example, say cycling, having that Lance Armstrong scandal, how that went out. You could argue that now in present day, essentially what Conte is saying, that these organizations don't want to catch the athlete, is what he's suggesting, and saying that he has, I forget now if it was directly an athlete or the athlete's coach. However, to my understanding, the athlete managed under him, he gets a call from an anti-doping agency suggesting this athlete has got caught. He'll update him. They call back and they say, look, it's not a good time for it to come out, so we're sweeping it under the rug. Now, he doesn't have a transcript in front of him, but if you look at it just from a perspective of, okay, what's my opinion on this? You can see how that idea plays out, and that, look, maybe some athletes are skirting the line, and maybe there's an underlying understanding that as long as you don't go too far, say you have a T-score of 5,000, if you have a T-score like 1,300 perpetually, and they catch you with like exogenous testosterone in your body on your test, or some other kind of steroid or whatever, that it'll be a slap on the wrist / just don't do anything stupid. You can understand how that plays out, but then you argue why so many Kenyans at the moment are getting caught if the intention is not to catch them unless they're doing outrageous amounts. Maybe that's the case. I haven't looked at the concentrations caught in these individuals, which is where it gets into a whole nother realm of, you could then start forecasting that, Kenyans have been dominant for too long, they want to quash this. But I don't buy that side of things to some extent, because then you've got other athletes from kind of more, you know what? To me, it has some potential, and I can see how, if an athlete is caught with a substance in their system and it's not too outrageous in volume, that a third party or someone, the IOC or someone, can get involved and be like, look, this ain't a good time. They're the greatest of all time. Let's say like a Usain Bolt. Say, for example, he was get caught with some kind of PED, and they go, you know what, this would completely it just ruin the general public's opinion on this hallmark event, so we just can't get out. But if someone who failed to get to the Olympics, right, gets caught in the background with a similar or higher level, they're like, this guy, if he gets caught, it's just like, he was doing everything he could to get to the top, didn't get to the top, and got caught. There you go. Goes down well. But that's essentially what he's insinuating, that there is corruption throughout, and he suggests that the athlete is the one getting the short end of the straw, because I suppose they're the ones at risk. They're the ones at risk both financially and their health, essentially, because they're taking the drugs, and if they get caught taking the drugs, they're the ones who then lose potentially their incomes. So where does it leave us then with present day doping? Now, Conti suggests that there are plenty of loopholes still left in the anti-doping code. Plenty of loopholes. As to what they are, doesn't fully elaborate. He simply puts, for one, the list of stimulants not banned out of competition but in competition. Now, he's saying they're large. There's loads of them that you could be using out of competition. Now, arguably, the way I look at it is, okay, imagine the greatest form of caffeine you can possibly imagine, right? That's ban. Using it, to me personally, stimulants in training, there's something really I leave for race day, to be honest, because I don't really want to be digging myself such a big hole in a training session that I need the stimulant. And things like caffeine are enough that if I'm going on a long ride, like 4 hours, or let's say 4, 5, 6 hours, or even longer, whatever it is, that maybe at halfway, my mood drops a little bit. I take like 200 milligrams of caffeine. I feel much better, and overall I enjoy the experience more. Do I need some bloody rocket fuel shoving up me? No. So what the performance benefit is outside, I'm not sure, feel free to correct me, whether the stimulants, a list of stimulants being not banned out of competition, is anything more than sort of semi-short-sighted, in the sense of you should probably just ban them in and out of competition. Maybe some of them, there's some arguments that the risk to health is incredibly low. Say caffeine, for example, they ban it in competition at 800 milligrams, but out of competition they don't ban it because it's like, who's going to take 1,500, 1,200 milligrams, 1,500, 2,000 milligrams outside of competition? Yeah, come on. He also suggests that he suggests against designer drugs. Now, whether this is because he's out the loop or whether it's to hide knowledge of designer substances or designer drugs that are being used, I'm not sure. But he points more to methods such as microdosing to limit the chance of being caught during testing during the day, essentially. And so by essentially microdosing yourself through the night, and then this kind of points to the perpetual use of stuff to give you a higher than normal physiological level on different blood markers and so on. Now, that kind of feeds into, if you buy into the corruption idea, then you could argue that the top athletes would be notified or tipped when they're going to be tested. Because the argument is that microdosing still has a risk. It limits your window of risk, but you could still get knocked on the door of at 4 a.m. and it hasn't fully cleared your system and you get caught. But you could argue that then the top athletes could get notified or just not tested between like earlier than 7 a.m., for example, to not hinder their performance at some event, to improve the spectacle. Because who wants Usain Bolt to rock up having had 4 hours sleep because he got woke up at midnight or something and then was stressed and couldn't get back to sleep and then has a poor performance? So you tell them, yeah, we'll only test you from like 7 a.m. onwards. And there that feeds into the fact that then microdosing becomes incredibly effective in the sense that it evades you being caught because of the fact that you know essentially the window and you can ensure that it's adequately out of the bloodstream. And then that feeds into the thin ice that, for example, cycling treads on, and where really, to me, anti-doping in general is a deterrent first, and second of all, it's to stop people taking the piss, really. As I said in the previous episode, which was more on the biological passport, it, to me, is there so it can't be completely rampant, uncontrolled, unmanaged, because as soon as you make it technical as to how you can do it correctly, it eliminates the people who are just going to rock up, buy a bunch of stuff, use all the stuff, and then it catches those people. You see what I mean? Like that's where I think its biggest success could be. I don't know, because people could be still doing loads of stuff, putting them like their lives at risk just through a designer substance that's, unmonitored. But I don't know. I thought it was a pretty good video. Feel free to put in the Discord server or email me at thevo2lounge@gmail.com with your thoughts. But I mean, if we take a moment to simply look at the comments on this, people seem to love it. They like how he's name dropping and just simply spilling all the beans. You can see how cynical the general public are, because there's a comment that is, nowadays whenever sports commentators say an athlete has turned back the clock or come back quickly from injury or come out of nowhere, I assume it's drugs 100%. And then the feedback is things like, good point, I love LeBron, but I think about it with him constantly. And then, you've just got that general feedback. You got used to be, if you hit 30 home runs, you were a god. Now you hit 30 home runs and you're looking for a job. On Jose Canseco on the impacts of performance-enhancing substances in Major League Baseball, which I assume is a reference. It's people talking about the fact that they've used stuff and adverse effects or seen the benefits, and then people saying Barry Bonds must have gotten his lawyers to get Conti to sign an NDA, because I'm impressed that in 25 minutes of discussion, Balco's history, he didn't mention Bonds a single time, despite being Balco's most prominent US client. Now, people come back and say it was Olympic specific, otherwise Bond would have for sure been mentioned. And so I had a little look. There are, to be honest, I think other outlets who are talking generically, and Conti essentially says, he's using the clear. Now, whether it was I know he was because I managed it, or just he was using it, that I'm not certain, but essentially he's exposed that in other locations. Essentially, this is very Olympic specific. There are athletes, he mentioned that weren't, but is what it is. You can find it elsewhere. But that really brings us to the end of the episode. This is a bit of a shorter one than normal, but it wasn't planned. It was essentially released the previous one because I was interested to do a review of the biological passport, then add some kind of skeptical views on how people navigate it, avoid being caught, and looked up some bits of information. And then probably because of that, I was fed straight to this video, which I would recommend anyone watch just because it's a little interesting watch, to be honest, little view. I think it's worth some time. So let me know what you think, what your takeaways are from this episode. And for more content like this, explore my previous episodes and consider following, rating, and sharing the podcast wherever you get your podcast from. Share your thoughts or suggest future topics at the vo2lounge@gmail.com or the VO2 Lounge Discord server. I have had a few people reach out on the VO directly to Gmail. Feel free to join the VO2 Lounge Discord because it really is what I'm trying to do, build a community there that, people can talk shit about sport and, physiological parameters and performance and their own sporting insights, really. So thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it's goodbye.